My pleasure to introduce IESVic, Program Manager at Clean Energy Canada, to lead this session. Evan has been with Clean Energy since 2021 and recently took the role of Clean Energy Program Manager. Before joining this organization, he served as Chief of Staff for the BC Green Caucus during the 2017-2020 minority government, where he played a key role in developing Clean BC, British Columbia's climate strategies. Please join me in welcoming Evan to lead us through this session.
Yeah, thanks everyone for being here. As River said, my name is Evan Pivnik. I'm excited to be the guide and facilitator for another 90 minutes. And thanks to the previous panel, I feel like you guys left a lot of baton passes to exactly the types of things that we're hoping to talk about here. So when this group of folks met about a month ago to just start planning out the panel, we agreed on a bit of an unofficial name for this panel. We wanted to really focus on catalyzing action. So when we talk about a lot of the barriers and challenges, we really want to talk about how can we turn those into seizing this moment in front of us. So we've been talking about transmission and interprovincial transmission in Canada for a long time. And there's some progress, but I think a lot less than everyone in this room hopes to see. But when we look internationally, as we heard yesterday, as Madeline spoke to in her opening remarks, there really is this moment where it's happening elsewhere. It's happening at a speed elsewhere. And the question is really, how can we capture that same piece here in Canada? I think we talked at the last panel, there was a lot of conversation about mutual gains and shared benefits. And I think that's some of the pieces we really want to dig into here. So for the next 90 minutes, we've got these three folks who are going to be sharing some thoughts on a bit of the current context in different places, some of the different solutions or pathways where we might actually seize this moment, catalyze new conversations, new actions, and actually start moving towards expanding transmission capacity in Canada. We've got short presentations from each of them that we're going to go through. We're going to have a bit of a discussion, but very much like the last one, it's going to be open to questions from the audience. So if there's things you want to ask, write them down. We're going to make sure we can get to all of those. So without anything else, I want to introduce our first speaker. Jason Dion is the Senior Research Director at the Canadian Climate Institute, where he oversees the mitigation research team, the Institute's Indigenous Research Stream, and the 440 Megatons Project. He's published extensively on electrification, carbon pricing, environmental risk, financial assurance, sustainable infrastructure, and environmental fiscal reform. He was a member of Canada's Electricity Advisory Council and serves on the board of the Canadian Association of Professionals in Climate Change. Over to you, Jason.
Great, thanks, Evan. So Evan asked me to just sort of set the table a little bit for the discussion that will come. So I'm going to draw on some slides from two different briefing decks, one being for the Big Switch, which was the Climate Institute's kind of flagship report on what it means to align electricity systems with net zero, and also the final report of the Canada Electricity Advisory Council, which was appointed by Minister Wilkinson to provide advice to the feds on the role they could play in this transition. So I'll start first with the Climate Institute's finding around how much bigger electricity systems need to become to meet climate goals and growing demand from electrification. So what we did was look across a number of major modeling studies that had looked at this question to say, okay, what is the sort of range that we're looking at in terms of system growth? And looking across a bunch of those studies that you can see it right there, we found that the range of growth was 2.2 to 3.4 times as big of a system by 2050 as we have today. So very, very large growth to meet climate goals. More recent studies have come in just a bit lower. So I think we are talking about that doubling to tripling of the system that you hear people throw around sometimes. Now, that might be a little different within provinces. So sometimes that those numbers can vary. And we have some breakouts of that on our project website for this project. But that 2 to 3 times really being the kind of thing that we need to have our eye on. Now, the Electricity Council also took a look at a number of recent modeling studies that had gotten into the cost of this big build out. And unsurprisingly, it's a really big investment challenge. So we're talking about trillions of dollars. And what they found, again, was there's a range in terms of how much money we might have to sort of bring to bear on this challenge. And in terms of the interventions that would be needed to help lower that cost, to push it to the lower end of that spectrum, they put some recommendations across 4 themes, these buckets that you see it right there. But the point really being that interties is a vital one of those. So that is a really important way of driving down the cost of this transition. And as a result, the council really took that as a major theme in its work and even struck a working group around that specific question of how do we unlock more interties in Canada. Now, another thing the council did that I thought was quite interesting was they really framed interties always in terms of their benefits for reliability. So this was a kind of strategic decision by that council that even though we are kind of focused on this in this context of that council's work, interties as a means to decarbonization and achieving climate goals, in fact, they thought it was much more productive and constructive to always frame it in terms of reliability. And they went as far as to produce a value stack to articulate all the different many benefits that you might get from a hypothetical Western interconnect that I guess Blake's dad was pitching a generation ago. And so, I mean, I won't go through them all in detail, but really what you can draw from this is that there is a way to frame it in terms of reliability all the time. And so many of these benefits are framed that way. But of course, we know, and we were discussing on the previous panel, that electricity trade within Canada often falls short of that potential. So in our own work at the Climate Institute, we took a look at those barriers and why they exist. And there's a lot of complexity and detail there, but at the highest level, we can say that it's a function of provincial systems still remaining really siloed all across Canada, and a lot of inertia, whether it's political inertia, public opposition, institutional cultures and mandates. There are a lot of sort of institutional, not formal barriers, sometimes formal, but often informal in the form of just continuing inertia. And yet the benefits of coordination and integration are clear. They've always been there, but as the last panel was discussing, decarbonization really brings them into focus. So there's a stronger case than ever for more integration. Now, in terms of what these two studies did in terms of their recommendations, I'll go a little quickly here because we're going to get into it in the discussion after. But the Institute's recommendation was that both levels of government, federal and provincial, use their tools to help facilitate and drive this development of interties. And provinces and territories are in the driver's seat, controlling most of the levers and having constitutional authority over electricity. So the Institute recommended that provinces and territories work bilaterally and multilaterally, really try to come at this bottom up, working with their neighbors and partners. And there are some specific ideas for what that looks like that we could get into. Also vitally, that they pursue independent pathway assessments and energy roadmaps as means of sort of unlocking the business case and getting some inertia in favor of interties. And again, we'll talk more about that in the discussion. I also wanted to make a quick plug here for a scoping paper we commissioned as part of that Big Switch project, written by Pierre-Olivier Pinault, where he looks at exactly this question about how can we unlock greater coordination and integration. And it also provides a really helpful overview of how different systems are governed and managed across provinces, because it can be just so different. And of course, we recommended that the federal government use its spending and convening powers. And now, what exactly does that look like? Well, that's where we can kind of pass the baton to the Electricity Advisory Council that really took that on, with their mandate being to provide advice to the feds on what their role can be. And it really came across in those two themes, those two buckets they had of enabling the build and supporting the transition. So on the one hand, when it comes to enabling the build, they had this idea for designating a champion to reform clean electricity project approvals. Now, on the one hand, that's about streamlining regulatory processes, but the other kind of clear recommendation there was that the feds start to designate clean electricity projects of Canadian interest. And so transmission obviously being like a prime candidate for what that could include, and that they actually start to kind of back it up formally in terms of the supports they're willing to throw at that project, whether it's financial, legal, regulatory, otherwise. And in terms of the specific ways they could support that transition through convening and funding power, there's a list here that you can see. We'll get into that in the discussion. I won't read it all out right now, but I did want to sort of put some of this on the table, that there are some real ideas out there. I know the previous panel started to get into this, of what roles could the feds play. Certainly money, certainly convening, and we'll hear about a lot more about those options in the two presentations that'll follow, as well as the discussion. So I'll leave it at that here. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Jason. So second, I wanted to introduce Kristen van der Biesenbros, who is a professor of law at the California Western School of Law in San Diego. Across her career, she's had a mixed transactional and litigation practice in New Orleans, taught at law schools across the US and Canada, including the University of Calgary Faculty of Law and Haskine School of Business. She teaches and writes on energy law and policy, especially community impacts of resource projects, electricity transmission and planning, and energy equity, and is widely published on these topics. She's also a member of the Board of Advisory Editors for the Tulane Law Review, the Mitigation Expert Panel for the Canadian Climate Institute, and is a former trustee of the Foundation for Natural Resources Law. Welcome.
Thank you. And thank you for having me. I'm excited as always to be sort of like the token law professor at the energy conference. So I am going to talk a little bit about what I see as a potential expanded role for the federal government, especially with respect to interregional transmission. But before I get started, I wanted to say a few sort of basic things. So it's true that the US, we often think about the US and their electricity system when we're thinking about expanding interties and what a interprovincial electricity market could look like. So the US has a pretty comprehensive set of interties, as you can see here from this map. This is a proposal for a macro grid to expand the build out of wind and solar energy, as the United States has tremendous wind and solar resources, but not in every part of the country. So a macro grid is something that FERC has been working on, well, at least working on planning to try to be able to more efficiently move wind and solar resources around the country, even to places where those resources aren't located. And then this is the Canadian grid. You can see that there are far fewer transmission lines. And for the most part, the system is a north to south system and not an east to west system. It's partially a result of historical economic development between hydro-rich provinces and the US, which has long been interested in buying cheap hydropower from the Canadian provinces, and relatively little economic activity going between the provinces, which of course is why we are talking about expanding the role for interregional transmission today. So just a few kind of general points on the macro level of law over electricity in the US and Canada. So in the US, both the US and Canada are federal republics. So they're different from other countries that have unitary governments where there's only really one government, the national government, and they make the laws. And so they can act in a way that is consistent throughout the country in setting rules and priorities, whereas Canada and the US are not like that. They have three different levels of sovereign government. There's the national government, the federal government. There are provincial and territorial governments in the states in the US, and then there are First Nations and tribal governments in both countries. So all of those different levels of government are sovereign and co-equal in power to each other, with the exception of the federal governments, which have whatever powers the constituent sovereign states or territories and provinces have chosen to give them in their constitutions. So first, when you're talking about federal republics, you're always going to have some tension between what the federal government can do and what the provincial government can do. And specifically what they can do is going to depend on the constitution of those governments. So the Constitution of the US and the Constitution Act in Canada are different in a lot of important respects. And sometimes, you know, when people talk about trying to transform the CER into FERC, for example, that would not actually necessarily be possible because the constitutional grant of power to the federal government in Canada and the US government is not the same. So with respect to federal powers, you have in the US, you have the Department of Energy and you have FERC. Regionally, you have reliability coordination through NERC. You also have ISOs and RTOs in certain parts of the US, except for the Mountain West and the Southeast. The US states are in charge of siting and construction, both transmission and distribution lines, and also regulate rates for distribution. And then you also have municipal laws like zoning laws and other land use regulations that can affect energy projects. In Canada, there's no specific grant of power over electricity systems to the federal government. You actually have a specific grant of power to over electricity systems, to provincial governments. And then for First Nations governments, Section 88 of the Indian Act gives the provinces the power to exert their regulation on Indigenous land. And then you also have, the level of control over electricity systems that provinces have in Canada is really unique. It is much stronger than what you see in the US. So in the US, initially, the regulation of utilities was entirely within state jurisdiction, but eventually the problem of who is going to control wholesale trade of electricity, so trade between one utility to another in another state, became a problem because in the US, the states have no ability to impose their own regulations, including rate regulations, on neighboring states. As equal sovereigns, one does not have power over the other. And so that led to what was called the Attleboro Gap, named after a case called Attleboro. And the US Congress responded to the Attleboro Gap by passing the Federal Power Act in 1920, which sets out the relative jurisdiction between the federal government, or FERC, and the states. So in the US, the federal government, FERC, has jurisdiction over transmission tariffs, but not siting and construction, wholesale power, including power markets, which they generally delegate to ISOs and RTOs. And then the states actually have jurisdiction over everything else. So it's not that FERC has comprehensive jurisdiction over transmission, they don't. In fact, it is a consistent problem in the US that for some reason, Congress gave siting and construction authority to FERC over natural gas pipelines, but not electricity transmission lines. And so FERC does not actually have the power to impose transmission plans anywhere because they don't have siting and construction power. So in Canada, historically, at least since Churchill Falls, those, if anyone here is from Newfoundland, the federal government hasn't really played a role in electricity. So even the very first interprovincial transmission line, which was a line that Newfoundland wanted to build from its Churchill Falls hydropower project to New England, ended up running into resistance from Quebec. And because the federal government wouldn't intervene, it resulted in a bilateral agreement between the two provinces, which, of course, if you're from Newfoundland, is a wound that will never heal until that contract is over, which may never happen. Sorry? 2040 it'll be over. And then ever since then, really, the federal government hasn't played a role. Does that mean they have no role to play? No, they don't have the same level of jurisdiction that FERC has because, again, what's in the Canadian Constitution is not the same as what's in the US Constitution. So in the US, the reason why the federal government has the jurisdiction it does is because of the Commerce Clause. So the US Congress has jurisdiction over anything in interstate commerce, which actually is technically everything now, which is why the US Supreme Court has been dialing this back over the past 20 years, because there was a moment where it sort of looked like it was going to eat everything and become the constitutional provision that basically got rid of all of the states' power. So under the Commerce Clause, wholesale power is under federal jurisdiction. And because, according to the Supreme Court of the United States, in a case from the 50s called Florida Power and Light, there's no way to tell for sure where electricity in any transmission line originated from. That gave the federal government, through FERC, jurisdiction over all transmission, no matter where located, except in Texas, where ERCOT is not connected to any other states. But in Canada, there's no provision like the Commerce Clause. The closest thing that Canada has is the Interprovincial Works Clause, but the most recent case law from the Supreme Court makes it pretty clear that the federal government's, the extent of its jurisdiction really ends at the point at which a project becomes inherently provincial. So it can have jurisdiction over some parts of a project, but only that part which could be correctly described as being interprovincial. And so from my perspective, that would suggest that the federal government, whether through the CER or any other federal entity, has jurisdiction over interregional transmission. It would only be the interprovincial intertie itself, and its jurisdiction would end at the moment on either side of the border that the interregional transmission line connects to a provincial grid. And so in my mind, one of the ways that we could potentially see the federal government exercise both its spending and interprovincial clause power would be to basically build through potentially a federal merchant transmission company, transmission lines that are interregional. That would be really important for Alberta because in Alberta, since they use cost of service rate making for their transmission utilities, any transmission line costs has to go into the rate that Albertans pay. So if you had a federal merchant transmission company that was able to only charge connected generators, that would prevent that cost from being passed on to people in Alberta. And of course, BC wouldn't have to pay for it either, or any other province that was being connected in that way. So I'm happy to take, I feel like I talked a lot longer than I meant to, and maybe talked really fast too, so.
Thanks, Kristen. Lastly, I wanted to invite Scott McDougall up. Scott is the director of Pembina Institute's electricity program based out of Ottawa. Prior to joining the Pembina Institute, Scott worked in climate policy and regulation at the Alberta Environment and Parks, electricity and oil sands extraction at Suncor Energy, and sustainability and clean energy consulting in Northern Alberta. I'm Scott.
Thanks a lot, Evan, and happy to be here with you folks. So as Evan said, Scott McDougall, Electricity Director at the Pembina Institute, and I'd like to talk about the importance of connecting Western Canada. Earlier this year, we wrapped up the first of a series of reports on regulatory barriers to Canadian electricity system decarbonization and electrification. That report is called Directing Decarbonization, if you want to look it up. Challenges fell into 6 buckets, you can see here, but today I'll focus on kind of part of the first one. So that'd be a limited interjurisdictional coordination. But that's not entirely exclusive of the other recommendations, so I'll just skim across those. So lack of strategic direction and governance on the path to net zero, slow and burdensome regulatory processes, complexities associated with adding new technologies to the grid, information asymmetries between electricity system stakeholders, especially between generators, government generators, customers. I guess I should broaden that. Utilities and customers, utilities and government. And then concerns around the affordability of a decarbonized electricity system. So I want to start with an example of successful interregional transmission planning that I think we can learn from Australia's national electricity market. I know we talk a lot about the US because they're our neighbors. I mean, we've often got lots of friends and colleagues down there. Our electricity systems are connected. But in a constitutional sense, Australia's electricity system is structured more similarly to Canada's, with the provision of electricity being a state responsibility, primarily. I recognize it's the spectrum, but that bias is a little bit more similar to Canada than the US, we think. So for history, in 1998, the country adopted a national electricity market in response to a Commonwealth government, that would be the federal government in Australia, inquiry into improving the productivity and efficiency of the electricity industry. So that's an interesting federal role in all of this, an inquiry into the efficient productivity and efficiency of the electricity industry. The national electricity market, which is both a wholesale electricity market and a physical power system, began as a 4-state interconnected grid. Today, 5 regional market jurisdictions have opted into the NEM, National Electricity Market, and this required new interties from the NEM to Queensland and Tasmania. The NEM is overseen by the Council of Australian Government's Energy Council, which is comprised of energy ministers from participating jurisdictions, as well as the Commonwealth minister, so federal minister. Since its inception, the NEM has lowered energy costs, brought in investment, shifted investment risk to capital markets, and maintained reliability of supply with few exceptions. So bringing us back to Canada, there's an exciting regional planning initiative in its early days that holds some promise, I think. It's called the Northeast Grid Planning Forum, and I'm hopeful this effort could be a model that could be replicated in the West as well. So the forum seeks to catalyze discussions among energy planners, government leaders, and community stakeholders to address policy and social concerns in energy system planning. Priorities include energy planning processes, infrastructure development, and market mechanisms that support clean energy. So right now, it's focused on essentially roundtable discussions on a few essential components of regional planning. They're not focused at the moment on trying to bring the governments and the system operators together to start talking and working out the details of more collaboration quite yet. They recognize that there's lots of barriers thrown up, but why that's not feasible yet. So they're working on unpacking a bunch of those. So they're focusing on local engagement. So obtaining local support for transmission projects can be one of the hardest parts of grid development. People often aren't sure. They want to bring projects, they want big projects in the backyard. It's important to put it in early work to understand those concerns, start conversations, and work with communities, First Nations, governments, civil society, and industry to address them. They're also focused on trying to create more conversations focused on that longer term outlook. So grid operators tend to coordinate only on short and maybe medium term planning with each other, with their neighbors. Long-term coordination across the region is often a new concept, but an important one. So discussions help draw out the full scope of shared reliability, affordability, and climate benefits interties can provide, as well as their shared costs when making business cases for large transmission projects. So they also start to unpack, they're also focused on trying to unpack cost and benefit identification. Since developing cost allocation frameworks, as we discussed in the last panel, and maybe some others yesterday, are really needed to start to distribute the costs and benefits more equitably across the regions and the participants in those markets. Is this going to shift? There we go. Further on cost benefit agreements, interties are important for reducing emissions and improving reliability, but also economically important. As the US National Renewable Energy Lab's NERIS study found, quote, transmission expansion and cooperation between Canada and the US can save the system tens of billions of dollars continent-wide, while transmission and cooperation between regions, like state and provincial grids, can save hundreds of billions of dollars continent-wide. So unpacking the costs and benefits of expanded interties a little, there's grid reliability and flexibility, there's resource sharing, increased renewable integration, and reduced costs. I could go into those, but I think I'm getting close to time. So no? Okay. So just to unpack grid reliability and flexibility a little bit. So since flows between geographic regions help balance supply and demand in case resources come offline or extreme weather events change local demand patterns. That's one benefit. There's resource sharing, where the benefits of different supply mixes and demand mixes can be shared over a broader area. And then you've got increased renewable integration. So sharing dispatchable resources like hydro creates more space for variable resources on the grid through increased grid flexibility. And then you've got reduced costs, where sharing resources more generally maximizes production from existing assets and reduces expensive generation overbuild, where you may run the risk of getting that issue if everybody goes it alone. So considering these needs to create win-win opportunities for consumers and businesses on both sides of the borders. And then just to wrap up, just wanted to emphasize that, I mean, Alberta has a long way to go, we think, in terms of intertie development. So this is from a jurisdiction scan we'll be publishing before too long. Happy for feedback, because I think many of you are seeing your jurisdictions in here. So we wanted to look at grids around the world that have achieved, anywhere in the range of, say, 30 to 70% of energy on their grids right now from wind and solar. Incidentally, we found that most of these have seen approximately a doubling of their wind and solar generation on their grids in the last 10 years. So that it's not just the level that they've achieved, it's the rate at which they've achieved it that we found pretty interesting. And we wanted to look at some of the big picture system enablers, technical enablers that allowed this to happen. And so that came down to interties. So these intertie numbers are the percent of intertie import capacity as a proportion of overall generation capacity. So that's denominator is generation capacity and numerator is intertie import capacity. Plus, we've got energy storage capacity and demand response in here. Because some regions, as you can see, Denmark, for example, we couldn't find a lot of demand response, but there's an enormous amount of intertie capacity. Texas is a little different, where there's very little intertie capacity, say 1% of generating capacity, but there's a lot of demand response and a lot of storage. It looks like there may be a sweet spot in there, somewhere between 11% of overall generation capacity and up to 28%, wherein, as you can see, a heck of a lot of wind and solar capacity can be brought online. And as you can see, unfortunately, I mean, for reference, I mean, Alberta is around 18% wind and solar energy on the grid, and they're down around 4% total for those technical capacities. So ways to go. Thank you.
Thanks. So we're going to dive right into discussion here. And I really wanted to start with something that is a real common thread, I think, across all of these presentations, which is just to start with role of the federal government. Because there's a couple of different ideas or propositions around what role they should play. So Jason, the Clean Electricity Advisory Council, I kind of boiled down their recommendations to sort of three pieces. There was planning tools to help identify the role and value. There was financing and actually helping incentivize this. And then there was working on the framework. And I think we heard framework come up. I lost count of how many times it was mentioned as common frameworks from the last panel as being key. Can you expand on whether or not, like, which of those you see as more important and whether this is an absolutely necessary and vital role that must be played, or one that would just help streamline this and that ultimately provinces can be looked at on their own to do this?
Yeah, I think the latter. I think that the leadership should hopefully and ideally come from provinces, but the assistance, and whether it's financial or otherwise, can come from the feds. And it could happen without it, but it might proceed a lot more efficiently with the support from the feds. And in terms of those pieces that the feds could bring to bear, I mean, they are all seen as complementary. On the one hand, the council recommended that there be enhanced funding for interties. So I think right now it's 15% under the ITCs. CCUS gets 50%. I mean, a lot of the others are at 15 or 30, but for something this vital where provinces can be as reluctant as they are, more money on the table, I think, would go a long way. And so they had some suggestions for either expansion of the ITCs, sort of holding funds that would be ready to strike agreements with interested provinces, where perhaps some, promise of alignment with best practices or certain approaches could be sought in exchange for that federal money, or also pre-reserving transmission capacity. So actually sort of taking a role in the eventual, not the operations per se of the transmission line, but buying some of its capacity to shore up the business case. So there's different ways the feds can bring money to bear. There was also some suggestions from the council on developing a standardized cross-border cost allocation mechanism. So just at least having a starting framework that provinces could use to haggle and negotiate over how costs would get distributed, given what's left after the Fed's contribution, and how benefits would get distributed as well. And as some of the other panelists were talking about, that idea of cost-benefit analysis and actually articulating and clarifying the values, the conversations between provinces might be more fruitful if there's at least a common framework of what benefits would be created and how they could be thought about being distributed across the parties. So those kind of frameworks and that sort of head start was seen as helpful, alongside things like designating certain clean electricity projects to be of national interest and bringing some federal heft and support there, as well as looking at the EU's projects of common interest framework, which I'm just reading off my slide. I don't actually know what that involves, but apparently it's worth a look. So this was all the outcomes of a working group at council, which was a lot of accountants and lawyers and engineers, but did come out with some pretty clear ideas of how the feds could use its powers in ways that weren't, stepping outside of jurisdiction or excessive, still leaving space for provinces to lead, just trying to work with those that see the value and want to pursue this sort of thing if the feds are there to help.
Yeah, and Chris, I'm curious with the proposal for the feds to come in almost through an arm of like the merchant side of doing this. What's the interaction with provinces and actually trying to get something like that off the ground? It's a very different sort of combination of push-pull tools in looking at it through that sort of merchant approach.
Well, I think the reason why, Mark Jackard had asked a question on his panel about who is going to start the conversation. And I think that's where the work that Jason is talking about is really useful, because the federal government has the convening power, so they can tell the provinces that they need to get together to discuss it. But the reason I think that I personally like the merchant transmission idea is that by creating a federal crown corporation that builds merchant transmission, you don't have quite the problem of the cost allocation is one thing, but it also will affect people in different provinces differently. And again, I sort of refer back to the fact that Alberta uses this cost of service rate making model for its transmission rates, which means that the capital cost of transmission lines built in Alberta is passed on directly to the ratepayers in the province. And so even if you have the federal government picking up some of that cost, there is no way to protect the people of Alberta from those additional. It's going to cause their prices to go up, and they're already extremely high for various reasons that people have talked about here. But it's also true that it's something that I think we've sort of alluded to before, that in BC, for example, you have BC Hydro, which is a provincial utility that owns its transmission lines, whereas in Alberta, you have investor-owned utilities, private companies that own their transmission lines. So they have shareholders, they have reasons why if something is going to get built, they are going to push for it to be built in a certain way because that's going to have a direct impact on their revenue. By taking that out of the equation, I think you eliminate at least some of the resistance from the investor-owned utilities in Alberta, because if there's no way that they're going to make any money off of it, then perhaps they'd be a little bit less inclined to fight for their own economic interests and any type of planning like that.
Is there any, and I just wanted to explore part of that, is there any risk that in not going through the process of the benefit accrual framework, that conversation about totally different benefits, different systems, that market structures work differently, but also different opportunities, that the process of reconciling some of those between provinces is actually one of the key exercises, and that then helps inform some of that cost allocation? I'm just curious, with the federal government coming in, how that piece fits in to some of those potentially important conflictual conversations.
Well, I think you still have to have that conversation about the wholesale prices, the actual price of the generated electricity that's being bought and sold, whether it's being bought and sold between the provinces or being wheeled from Alberta to the US. This would just be about the transmission component. It's not about the actual cost of electricity that you're paying for, by megawatt hour. So you still actually have to have the benefits conversation. And then with respect to benefits and burdens of the transmission projects themselves, that's actually a community level conversation. And so whether the community is dealing with the federal government, the provincial government, whoever, I think those justice concerns, the distributive justice concerns of a transmission line, are not something that can actually be necessarily resolved by province to province conversations. That's always going to have to be a bottom up conversation, I think.
Yeah, I don't know, Scott, just from the bottom up and looking at Alberta in general, I'm just curious about some of the work that PEMA has done in bringing stakeholders together for some of these conversations, and thinking about different opportunities, different benefits, some of those costs like that need to have that conversation. I think, as Mark spoke to, there is a political economy question to this. There's a whole variety of, when you poll Canadians, British Columbians, Albertans, the idea of self-sufficiency ranks incredibly highly. Even they'd pay more for it if it meant it could be here. And I'm curious about any reflections you've seen from the groups you've brought together in Alberta on this.
I might jump across the country for a second just to look at the Northeast Grid Planning Forum and where they're at, and try to map that onto what could be done in Alberta to a greater extent. Because one thing they recognized working with different stakeholders and regulators and system operators in the Northeast states and Eastern Canadian provinces was that there were a lot of objections projected on community level stakeholders by, sort of big picture policymakers and utilities and things like that. And there was a real need for engagement at the community level to try to identify the challenges, map them out, start to unpack them with folks so that they could be rather proactively worked through. Because there's a lot in it. I mean, to your point, there's a lot in it for consumers and communities to see a lot more transmission built and a lot more interties and, a lot more linkages with neighboring provinces and states. But people don't necessarily want to see big piles of wires in their backyards. And there's some myth busting, but there's actually a lot of real legitimate, concerns to unpack, where you got to work through the benefit agreements for the communities in order to get their buy-in. So the Grid Planning Forum folks are really putting a lot of early focus there at the grassroots community level to try to build the case for these projects that they can sort of, bring back to the system operators and the regulators and the governments in those regions to say, hey, you know what, I think we've kind of worked through a lot of this stuff, and this route and that route and this route. I think people really get the benefit that they could get from these, and here's some frameworks that they're sort of notionally aligned with for some of these projects. You could really get going, and the political economy we think we've paved the way for a lot of this stuff to get done. Off you go. So they're going to try that model. I'm really interested in learning from that, and I'd be very curious about replicating that in Alberta.
Yeah, Kristen, can you speak at all to how the state of similar conversations in the WEC region? I'm just interested in some of the comments from the last panel about just the maturity of the conversation in different regions, that there's perhaps more experience with that collaboration out east versus out west. But
well, I think that, since the 1920s, FERC has had jurisdiction over transmission rates in everywhere in the country, even if, parts of the country have independent system operators or RTOs that are acting as the balancing authority and coordinating competitive markets for electricity. But there are also, the Southeast and Mountain West we'll see what happens in the West, but they have maintained their vertical integrated monopoly structure there, but FERC still has jurisdiction over the rates. So I think the experience in the states has long been that you cannot avoid dealing with the federal government when it comes to transmission. And so I think that's just something that's sort of taken for granted there, that there are ways in which, especially investor-owned utilities, try to derail certain transmission projects, especially regional transmission projects. Certainly the US has problems with regional build out for transmission that are not the same problems that we have, but you still see some economic protectionism coming from transmission utilities in the US. So I would say that it's not quite as easy as it appears sometimes. I think it's just a different conversation in the US. But I do think the maturity really comes from a long-standing relationship between FERC and state public utility commissions when it comes to transmission planning and build out. And you just don't have that history here. This has been something that's totally within provincial authority, has been up until now. And I think the idea of ceding any level of control is really uncomfortable for most provinces.
yeah, and I guess maybe a question for all of you, because again, this was a common thread for me across trying to think about how we can catalyze a different conversation about transmission in this moment. And it's really like, where does the spark need to happen for that? Like, and I won't put words in your mouth, Scott. I'm hearing, bottom up to a certain extent there, role of the federal government in taking a certain financial piece of this off the table so that we can really move into, okay, this is, financed to a certain extent. Let's start to really get to this. Just interested from each of you around what would be sparking a different conversation. Where does that start, to boil it down to a starting place, knowing it's a complex area and going to involve a lot of folks?
Sure. I'll go quick because I think everybody's probably got something to say on this. Yes, bottom up. I think that's really important, but I'm really I think it's really neat the way the national electricity market in the US was triggered by that. I guess it was a direction by the federal government in Australia to look at ways to increase the reliability and economic efficiency of the grid. And out of that was triggered the notion of creating more linkages between the states and integrating their markets together. It wasn't presupposing that integration was required. It was just, let's study this. So I'm curious about that as a federal role. I mean, I think the feds are probably a little nervous about seeming more excited about something than the provinces. So maybe there might be some reticence there, but like that kind of study could be something that the federal government looks at. And I think it was, Kevin, not to put you on the spot, but I was really interested when you talked about the challenges of trying to do that kind of study and just how there's a lot of different angles on it, but it's just so important to try to unpack that. So yeah, I'd love to hear more about the challenges.
So So I agree that I think the federal government could play an important part, whether it's using the convening power or conducting a study. But I think one thing that would be really helpful for all of the provinces, let's say BC and Alberta, is to really sort of emphasize that there is a tremendous amount of economic growth and opportunity here, and that, this is something that's happening in other places. And Canada is at risk of being left behind. I mean, BC does have the ability to participate in whether it's, Southwest Power Pool Plus or whatever's happening with possible Western ISO. But I think Alberta has, with its tremendous wind and solar resources, it really has the ability to be an export powerhouse, and it has reliability problems. And I get that there's this idea, longstanding idea, that self-sufficiency is important, but I agree. In the US, the idea that, one of the greatest ways in which you can ensure reliability is through interconnections. The more, the better. And so I don't think it's actually an either or. I think you can be sort of self-sufficient, with respect to average load, but I don't think that there's anything inherently threatening to self-sufficiency by saying that the more interconnections that you have, the better it is for everybody involved when it comes to reliability. And that's especially true now because climate change is making these extreme weather events more and more common, and it's causing these unusual spikes in demand at unusual times of day, unusual times of year. It's putting a lot of pressure on grids in both provinces. And I just think, practically speaking, one of the best ways that you can try to protect the grid from failure in the event of an unexpected weather event, outages from extreme weather, is to have those sort of deeper interconnections.
Yeah, and I think I could pick up there that I think that's one of the most compelling arguments that you can make around this, that self-sufficiency sounds good in theory, but it also means you're on your own. And if we think of Texas a couple of years ago and their big freeze and all the challenges their power system had, they had neighboring regions that were in surplus that could have helped if they were better interconnected. So emphasizing that the cost of self-sufficiency can be, undermine reliability is a way to sort of perhaps provide a bit of a spark for some of these conversations. But I think it's also about economic efficiency, as Scott was saying, and we've been a big proponent that provincial governments should be commissioning independent pathway assessments that show all the different economy-wide options for getting to net zero and their implications for electricity systems, and that there be a real fulsome accounting of the different scenarios and possibilities that includes doing it with and without significant interties. Because I think it's only once decision makers and policymakers see just how costly and difficult it would be to do all of this on their own, that alternative of greater interconnection really comes into focus as a more attractive alternative. So I think there's lots of things that we can do to provide that spark and create the fertile ground. The other thing I would say is it's always going to be context specific, and just start where it makes sense to start. And I've been really encouraged by Ontario and Quebec working more closely together with a seasonal swap. One is winter peaking, the other is summer peaking, and they've agreed that they're just going to exchange power at their different, peak season parts with no price, with no commercial trade going on. It's just a straight swap. And that is going to be the catalyst for more integration and coordination that the Ontario government is calling for, that Hydro-Quebec's interested in pursuing. So starting somewhere, building those relationships, building that trust. I mean, it's just a matter of what can work in this jurisdiction, and let's go from there.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to look at East Coast general, because we have the Atlantic Loop in Canada. That was some important lessons to learn from it, I think. You've got the Northeast trying to unlock offshore wind. You've got Ontario, frankly, in their new energy plan, massively expanding export of energy down to the US as an absolute priority. And again, in the last panel, we had this comment of opportunity or threats triggering that change. And it doesn't feel like there's either sufficient one of either one of them that have triggered it out in the West here yet. And I'm just curious what role that sort of regional kind of pull from the US as a catalyst, as opposed to a more domestic conversation. Is it more important to lean into that region, and that regional conversation will actually force both Alberta and BC to sort of reconcile certain pieces because the opportunity down south is just so great? Curious if any of you have reflections on that.
Let's look at you. Do you want to start that one?
Oh, well, I was just going to say, in the previous panel, I think Kevin mentioned that the minister in Alberta is always talking about, wouldn't it be great if we could export? Well, you can. you need to have a plan. And you need to, do the work to commission the studies. I mean, whether you're doing it as like multiple pathways to reliability, you don't necessarily have to think about it as probably politically, it's better not to think about it this way in Alberta as a deep decarbonization tool. But I mean, for Alberta anyway, there's a huge opportunity to take part in this really robust renewables market in the US. But to get there, it's better to go through BC than through Montana. So there's no real reason why it can't work that way, except that it's going to take cooperation and collaboration and just thinking about things in a way that you've never thought about them before, which, I mean, it's a little bit frustrating because yes, it is difficult to change the way things are done, but I think the example that we see internationally is that it certainly isn't impossible. And so what does it take to get the political will to do it? I mean, for Alberta, I think it's always been difficult because they don't have a provincial utility. So there's not like a unified force in Alberta the same way there is in other utilities. But I think somebody needs to come to the Alberta government and say, look at all the money that you are just leaving on the table. Look at all the solutions out there for the grid that you just leave on the table because you're not pursuing these opportunities. So yes.
So I can maybe comment on the BC and Alberta intertie possibility by kind of telling a funny story where in our Big Switch report, we convened a whole bunch of stakeholders. So, utilities, regulators, system operators, governments, independent experts from all across Canada in this virtual gathering that was focused on unlocking interties. And a bit cheeky, we sort of decided, okay, well, let's do breakout rooms where we pair kind of regional neighbors, one with a big hydro system, the other with a thermal system that might decarbonize with wind and solar, and sort of make the case that, you guys should get together and what about that? So it was kind of like these little matchmaking dates that we arranged. And so we had a moderator in each room and we recorded all the sessions. So I watched them all after, and it was hilarious how different the conversations were. So for the Atlantic provinces, this was in the heydays of the Atlantic Loop. It was, we're excited, lots of potential. They're into really the practicalities and, maybe the ambition scaled back a bit since, but still a real recognition that it maybe can and should happen. Between Quebec and Ontario, it was this funny thing of they were kind of eyeing each other warily, like, well, maybe if he kind of comes to the right price, we'll see, which I guess they more or less did by not having a price. Saskatchewan and Manitoba was interesting because it was, well, we see it, we're both big integrated crown utilities, and it's just a matter of the two of us agreeing in many ways. So the politics around it might be the trickiest part, that self-sufficiency idea. BC and Alberta was a completely different conversation. So in that room, Blake was the moderator, and he had a hell of a time even convincing that group that there were enough benefits to pursue, or at least parts of that group, and wasn't really able to even progress that far into the how. So it's a very different conversation. It's understandable. You've got a vertically integrated crown utility. You've got a privatized system mostly. You've got very different political cultures, economies. So it's always felt like the toughest nut to crack. And I think it becomes a useful case study in that way because it sort of really exemplifies all the barriers you can run into. But it might remain one of the tougher pairing of jurisdictions to break loose. So I thought it was kind of funny that this conference is organized around it. And I also want to add that I will hold the organizers responsible if we don't get a BC Alberta intertie for me missing Halloween with my kids.
Yeah, that's good. Yes, yeah, I was going to say, if folks have questions, like start raising hands and we'll make sure the mic's moving around. Go ahead.
I just want to continue on that market structure comment, and Holman's left, so I can pick on him a little bit. He was a little cheeky when he said, well, if Albertans want to just export, they can export. That's not really true in practice. I mean, I speak from experience, my experience at TransAlta. You can't just sell at the BC border. BC doesn't have a buy price sticking there. It's only BC that can suck in and sink. You can wheel through to Alberta or to the US, but in reality, BC holds the network firm. And when the opportunities abound, that network firm is held up. And so you can't reliably be an exporter and sell. And so these market differences versus, like you said, Jason, Saskatchewan and Manitoba, neither has market prices, but they can come up and have these bilateral arrangements. There's no real comparable thing here. I suppose BC Hydro could have a bilateral agreement with individual potential exporters and do it one-off. They'd have to pick their favorites. But I think that we didn't talk enough about that, but that discrepancy in the fact that if you want to sell or buy from Alberta, there is a price and you can transact, but there's no such thing that exists in BC. And so the Albertans often look at that and say, well, this is not a level playing field. There's nothing I can access to sell or buy from. Any thoughts in terms of what needs to be done to, or who would instigate that to make BC more reciprocal in terms of access?
You're asking me, I was going to ask you. So.
Kristen, do you have something on that one?
Well, I mean, I'm not an economist, so, approach me with your legal questions, Blake. But it occurs to me, though, that at least initially in the US, there were actually two different markets. There were the retail markets for electricity inside the states, but then the wholesale markets for power, which was a different thing. And I wonder if something like that is a place where you could start, where you're not just trying to put two very different provincial markets together, but you could potentially create a parallel market that's specifically for these sort of import-export sales. And so you don't, because I think sometimes like one of the biggest problems is trying to figure out how to force these two markets to work together, but they won't. So that would be my thought, is that, is there a way actually to say, I mean, I don't know if you would do, many of the ISOs in the US run energy only and capacity markets, and they're not run the same way. And so I don't necessarily see that there isn't a solution, kind of a similar type of solution where we actually have two different markets for different customers, one of them in the province and then one of them for those interprovincial and international buy-sell.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems like something, if an expansion needs to occur, it seems like that's a give that BC needs to make, where for their participation in the Western energy imbalance market, they had to create an LMP at the border that people could deposit or pull from, and they're on the hook for a price. It seems like something like that with Alberta would need to be required to move it forward.
Just struck actually again with the last panel, the comment about the role of incumbents. And I think the incumbents equally apply at times to ASO, BC Hydro, the politics that have evolved between them in either allowing for, facilitating, feeling like there's room for certain conversations. So I'm curious, like beyond, so the role of a third party, whether it's federal government coming in, a third party civil society, if it's talking about trying to do bottom up, curious about what roles third parties have in trying to facilitate it, creating different market structures, and where those really come from.
I mean, of course it can be constructive, and I think there's so many different ways you could approach this, and which group would be seen as credible and good faith to those two parties is everything. But in some ways, there's just no substitute for time and familiarity, that the two sides need to be more comfortable, more trusting of each other. Those relationships exist. We did a case study in the course of the Big Switch work that looked at the Nordic power pool and like, well, how did that come to pass, that these sovereign nations are all better integrated and working across borders more successfully than Canadian provinces can? And there's a long history, and it's a complex case study. It was written by Sean McCarthy, the former energy and climate reporter at the Globe. But the title was telling. It was Nordic Cooperation, Canadian Provincialism. And it goes back to a long history of them working together on shared challenges, recognizing the complementarity of their systems potentially, and slowly becoming more comfortable with the idea of, designated third parties, being responsible for the management, or at least parts of their own, internal planning, and just that comfort with not ceding authority, but at least being more open to different ways of integration and looking beyond their own borders as a result. And I think the part of the conclusion was there's just no substitute for that history. It's going to take time to build these relationships. And regardless of who the third party intermediary is, these people have to come to the same table. And that is not happening as much as we might like sometimes, I think we've heard.
For you, does that start with a focus on something like the cost benefit, like the benefit accrual studies, the ability to start to actually reconcile differently weighted benefits and opportunities? Is that actually?
I think that's a big part of it. And it does feel a little chicken and egg with interties sometimes, that like the business case isn't super strong necessarily. It's better for the system that gets built up around those interties. So that can make it a tough nut to crack. So long-term studies that are looking at, well, what would be the business case for this over the long term? What is the value that would be created? How would it get distributed under current approaches? What would be a fair distribution? Without starting to grapple with the scale potential here and the cost savings, I think that we're just sort of, spinning our wheels in terms of a theoretical discussion of benefits that are knocked down in the face of kind of hand waving about self-sufficiency.
So again, the idea then from the Clean Electricity Advisory Council of the federal government role in some sort of high-level frameworks that were starting points. Is that, like, for me, the conversation had to start between and involve directly each of the jurisdictions we're talking about. What role does that sort of higher level framework play then in trying to trigger some of those conversations?
I mean, it's a funny one where I think it was left a little deliberately vague in the final report of like, what exactly are we talking about, and which group? Is it an existing group that's given a new mandate or authority, or is it a new body? I think there's too many ways to approach this, and really it's the art of the possible. And there's no substitute for the provinces coming together themselves in the first place. But to the extent to which that conversation can be facilitated by some third party that's perceived as good faith, not having a direct stake or vested interest at play, can certainly help.
My head goes to the sort of multi-party negotiation frameworks that you'd see in pretty much any law school. And feel free to whip the mic right out of my hand because I'm right in your wheelhouse. But so you've got those sort of, I'll call them standard, but they're not standard. They're actually very nuanced kind of multi-party frameworks where it's a lot of work to surface the sorts of concerns and opportunities and challenges and trade-offs associated with, you know, lots of different parties to an agreement, especially where you've got one that's so complicated and then muddied by the information asymmetries that I talked about as barriers in electricity, like decarbonization, like electricity decarbonization, regulatory developments in general. So I think that there is a role in some of these third parties to help give some credence to some of those trade-offs and try to bridge some of those information asymmetries a bit to try to help inform what could be in these frameworks, because there's a lot in there's a lot for everybody, I think, in terms of benefits and challenges that gotta get worked out. And sometimes I think especially some of the grassroots folks really need somebody looking out for them to try to identify that sort of stuff and surface it.
And I would just add that I think it would be really useful to have some kind of neutral third party that was, you know, facilitating these bilateral markets, because not to give BC a hard time, but I personally don't understand how BC Hydro creates its prices. And the information behind that is not available. And if you try to get it, you will fail. So I think that there needs to be a lot more information sharing too. And it could be that one of the ways to allay concerns about the competitive effect of releasing information would be to give it to a neutral third party that isn't necessarily going to make the information public, although making it public would help with transparency a lot. But just as a first step, you know, a neutral third party that doesn't have any kind of particular skin in the game other than to facilitate this bilateral trade to the extent possible would be really helpful, because the information is not available right now. And I don't actually, I think that's also one of the kind of missing pieces, is that how do we do this when, you know, we don't even really know for sure how prices are even being generated.
Out here, yeah.
Hi, sorry, it's Peter Fairley, freelance journalist. A legal question. In the US, we have a Supreme Court that seems skeptical of federal power and is happy to toss out precedents. And I'm wondering to what extent that's a threat to FERC's authority and to what extent that's already impacting what FERC is doing.
So in the US, FERC is an administrative agency, and the current Supreme Court really doesn't like administrative agencies. That is definitely true. And they are curtailing, I think, the extent to which the agencies can make, I wouldn't say necessarily novel interpretations, but to the extent that FERC, for example, wanted to use the language of the Federal Power Act in a way that it hasn't before, I think this current Supreme Court would be problematic for that. I don't actually think that this current Supreme Court would try to take away power from FERC that it has been exercising. And partly that's true because FERC has not been as aggressive about exercising the power that it arguably has, as you might expect. Like a lot of administrative agencies that work closely with state agencies, FERC tends to take it easy on states that are willing to work with them. And so in some ways, I think it's been to the frustration of a lot of energy policy people in the US that it hasn't been a more aggressive agency when it comes to the power that it could assert. So I'm not really sure that FERC needs to worry about any rollback of its powers, but to the extent that, FERC tried to do something that they've never done before, they could run into some issues with that. There are several legal cases against Order 1920 that are pending. And if they did end up going up to the Supreme Court on cert, it would be interesting to see what the court would do with that. For what it's worth, the Canadian Supreme Court is not nearly quite, the Canadian Supreme Court has historically been not interested in putting itself into a position of resolving dicey political issues. So they tend to, even when they have to make a determination, like the carbon tax cases, for example, even in that case, you can see the Canadian Supreme Court's decision is extraordinarily narrow and doesn't actually create a lot of usable precedent for the federal government. So historically, the Canadian Supreme Court isn't nearly as interested in wading into these thorny issues as the US Supreme Court is.
Kristen, while you have the mic, you started talking about the data that we don't have and mentioned, price generation data. Is there other key areas where there's fundamental gaps in what's available to even be able to start to ask the right questions outside of being on the inside of one of the utilities or planning organizations?
I mean, I think a lot of people in this room could probably give you more insight about that because many of you, I think, have tried to collect some of this data in order to conduct the studies that you've been doing. I think in Alberta, it's somewhat easier. I mean, the ISO needs to have data in order to run, the market. And the Market Surveillance Administrator also receives a great deal of data. So I get the impression that a lot of what you need from the Alberta side is currently available, but to the extent that there's probably more information that would be useful, that is probably true, but I think there's probably people in the audience who could answer that question better than me about what exactly you would need.
Okay. Scott, you'd mentioned the Northeast grid, and I was curious if you could expand a little bit more on just some of the, as you've looked at it and as you see it as one of the sort of clearest examples of what we ought to be aspiring to. Where did it really start? What are some of those key pieces you saw that really kind of triggered the right conversations? Like, what are the lessons we should be pulling from it?
Sure. I think where it started was a bit of an informational interview questionnaire kind of approach by the Regulatory Assistance Projects in the States. Partnered with the Transition Accelerator group, Electrifying Canada, where they sat down with a whole bunch of different stakeholders in US and Canadian electricity markets in the northeastern North America to try to unpack opportunities, challenges, regulatory tripping hazards, technical tripping hazards, stakeholder concerns. I mean, just a whole bunch of different things to try to figure out, well, what could be done jointly to try to improve outcomes for system operators and consumers from a regulatory perspective, a cost perspective, as well as an emissions perspective. So it came out of that more long-term coordination around planning was of high value. And I guess that, to me, is what triggered the formation of the Northeast Grid Planning Forum. So there's a couple of nonprofits, one on the US side, Acadia Institute out of New York, and then another one out of Quebec, Nergica, that are sort of the main engines, I guess, for pulling the forum together and pulling together meetings and doing studies and little white papers and things like that, and just continuing to convene folks in roundtable discussions to try to surface opportunities, threats, that sort of thing around a bunch of different themes. And like I was talking about, there's the sort of grassroots work around the transmission projects themselves. There's cost benefit framework discussions as well. I'm blanking on, I guess it was market integration was another theme area that they're pretty focused on. So I guess it's really about trying to keep the conversations alive so that folks can try to work through their challenges and get through some of the baggage. I would love to see that. I mean, a lot of people talk about how the Northeastern, in the Northeastern case, there was already a lot more integration out there. So I guess some of the market linkages were maybe a little bit more mature in some areas. Folks were in the Atlantic provinces already pretty animated about interties, say, between Newfoundland and Quebec, for better and for worse, but also around the Atlantic Loop, opportunities there for more interconnections to enable more offshore wind. So those were very live. People were seeing the opportunity space as well as the challenges. And my understanding is in the US Northeast, there were similar sorts of linkage conversations going on. So that was things are at a different spot than they are in the West. But I'm really optimistic that with a little bit more time and some focused effort on the conversations, maybe the West could come along too.
Is that a process you see focusing primarily on starting with BC and Alberta specifically, or broader and looking regional?
I mean, a lot of people's heads go to BC and Alberta just because of the emission. I mean, I'm totally preaching to the choir here. I mean, Alberta generates 10% of Canada's electricity. It's got about, a little less than half of the emissions in the electricity system. So, there's a huge opportunity to address there. Doesn't necessarily have to start with Alberta and BC, though. Saskatchewan and Quebec, there's opportunities. Sorry, Saskatchewan and Manitoba. Sorry, I jumped one. There's a lot of opportunities there. That's not to gloss over challenges in that context either, because there was that legal case, between Manitoba, Saskatchewan over their interties and market linkages as well. There's also linkages to the US states that pose great opportunity. I saw a really interesting report. I think it was called Wires to Change the World, or Grids to Change the World, where they looked at interties around the world to see which ones would have the biggest impact on climate. And number one in their report was an intertie connecting Manitoba through to Chicago. That kind of blew my mind. And unpacking that a little bit, it looks like it was around offshore wind development that's potential on the Hudson's Bay in Manitoba, and connecting major build out of that through to Chicago as an example. So I think there's opportunities in lots of places, but yeah, I got a soft spot for Alberta, BC.
Yeah. So I guess I'm also curious on the other side with the Atlantic Loop, and just any lessons, especially in thinking about a role from federal government. So I don't know, Chris and Jason, if either of you have comments on that process, the way the federal government came in and playing that role. It tried to do some convening. It tried to put some money on the table. It potentially tried to talk a little bit about benefit accrual and who's benefiting from which pieces. What are the lessons for you in that, and how do those, and can we apply some of them in the conversations that we're talking about between Alberta and BC here?
I don't have a ton to say about this, but I think one of the most powerful lessons for me has been that, it's okay to aim high and to have the big conversation about potential. And just because you don't end up there doesn't mean you failed. Like the fact that there is some progress still on the idea of connecting Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, and that can be built on in the future. That's not a loss, and I don't think it was all a wasted effort, not by a long shot. But I think it's probably for the best that they did aim big from the beginning. And probably a lot more detailed lessons to learn about the way those conversations were organized and facilitated, the types of supports that were on the table. I don't know enough to weigh in specifically on that, but I think it's not a failure to have not gone to the full scope that you imagined from the beginning.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, if we're talking about maturity and familiarity being a big part of the conversation, then even just getting together and trying to come up with a plan, having those conversations is actually one way that we build comfort around the idea of interregional transmission.
Yeah. So, and Kristen, can you just talk a little bit more then about like when you've looked across here since I think you first published the paper that really made the case for this sort of, specific role for the federal government, there has been efforts, as in Atlantic Canada, the Atlantic Loop for the federal government coming in. I think talking to them, there's a reluctance to try and play that same active role. So is that moving that out to something like the CER and looking at spinning it off that way? Can you just expand a little bit more on what it would look like for the federal government to come in and take that sort of middle space, but also helping facilitate some of that benefit conversation that needs to take place?
And you have to name drop the title of your report, which
Well, it was called Lost in Transmission because I don't think it's possible to have an energy paper without an energy pun. It's like my neighbor who has a Polestar and he has a license plate that says "Watt Up."
It's
like
yeah.
energy watts. Anyway, well, as far as like the idea that I was talking about in my paper with the interprovincial works clause. So, and there are people here from the CER who can speak to this too. The federal government knows that it has the constitutional, at least that it could make the argument that it has jurisdiction over interregional or interprovincial transmission because it was in the National Energy Board Act and it's in the CER Act. There is a provision there that says we have jurisdiction over this, but then where the procedure for doing that, I mean, you have to get an order in council from Parliament in order to designate a line as being under CER jurisdiction. And then as far as the process that the CER would use or process that the CER would use to permit a line like that, there's really nothing there. So it's been sort of like a placeholder. So right now, in a very real way, even if the federal government wanted to exercise that kind of jurisdiction, it hasn't created a way to do that. So I think that would be one of the first things to do would be to work with the CER and think about like, well, how would we even do this if we were going to do it? Even if all you wanted to do was sort of play a kind of permitting role to expedite the build out of a transmission line, there's no way to do that right now. So there's just a bookmark. And that's all. And so I think that if the federal government were serious about at least even just wanting to be able to meaningfully threaten the provinces with it, like if you guys, I will stop this car right now and build this transmission line myself if you can't figure it out, except that it's a hollow threat right now because there's no way to actually do it. And so I think that would be one place to start is maybe just having the CER, use their expertise to figure out how would they permit this line? How would they build it if they were going to?
Just want to make sure I hadn't missed any questions or hands that had gone up there. Just with sort of a few minutes left here, I wanted to just give each of you a chance. We did quick presentations speaking to a bunch of different, each of you have worked on a part of this from a different perspective, some bottom up, looking at a unique approach with the federal government through the Clean Electricity Advisory Council. I'm curious when you think of trying to catalyze a different conversation when it's this moment that we're in now where we're seeing it take off. What is for you the sort of greatest opportunity for a different approach? Is it looking regionally? Is it really fundamentally bringing in new structures? Like where would you be starting that conversation?
So we've been a big proponent for energy roadmaps from governments. And the backstory on this is that when we came to the big switch work, a lot of people were pointing out to us that, regulator mandates can be a real sticking point. We're not getting we put it in terms of a bigger, cleaner, smarter system. We're not really focused on that goal. We're more kind of looking at just what we can see on the horizon. And the problem with that is pretty much all of the climate policies we've implemented don't really look further than a decade out, best case. But this transition has implications over decades. It's a challenge when regulators can only go off of existing policy. So sure, we might have long-term climate targets, but because those aren't backed up in policy, they're limited in their ability to approve construction plans and investments that would be focused on that longer term goal. And that really has the machinery stuck. And so the package of things that we came to that would help overcome that, well, I mean, the first, of course, would be implement climate policies in line with your climate goals. But that's going to remain an elusive goal. I mean, we're having a hard time keeping the ones that we have, let alone kind of looking farther than that. And maybe it would be unduly rigid to try to set out a fixed path all the way to net zero anyway. So rather to kind of correct for that gap and the problems it creates, we kind of recommended this trio of, well, give updated mandates to your regulators and crown utilities and system operators that they are to focus on climate goals and enabling electrification. And how you operationalize that mandate is a complex question, but it's one goal. A second is to commission these independent pathway assessments that give everybody a sort of shared set of information about what the options are and what their pros and cons are. But the third is energy roadmaps. And these are documents authored by provincial governments that give guidance and guardrails to the utilities and system operators charged with this transition and the regulators, and give everybody not only some signposts, but a defensible basis for their decisions. And in this way, these documents are policy. And we've actually seen some of these start to get developed, and maybe a bit surprisingly, Ontario is one of the strongest ones with its Powering Ontario's growth plan last year, and now its plans for an integrated resource plan next year. Now, there's gaps in that plan, but what it does is set out the government's vision for how it wants this energy transition to unfold. It's not even anchored in 2050 net zero climate targets. It's just sort of saying, look, we know load growth is here. We know there's economic opportunity, and it directs the ISO to go about a sort of all of the above approach to meet that growing demand and be ready. And Leslie Gallinger, the president of ISO, was on the council and said when this plan came out, this in fact gives me everything I need to get on with the job now. So these energy roadmaps can really break the logjam, and it also provides an opportunity for provinces, for governments to articulate for themselves how they'd like this transition to unfold. And, the truth is we might not always see what things we like or hope to see in there, but you can politically contest those things. And, an example I would point to is Ontario's energy plan has it deeply committing to gas distribution systems in ways that my organization has found like, okay, well, continuing to expand the gas network might not be in the long-term best interests of consumers. So I don't agree with that part of the plan, but it does provide clarity on the future role of the gas system and sort of fills an uncertainty gap that could risk leaving things paralyzed otherwise. So that kind of energy road mapping and those planning documents, I think, can go a long way. And critical, they come from provincial governments. You can't just leave this to utilities to do for themselves because of that, difficult position that them and their regulators are in otherwise.
I agree with that, although I would say in the case of Alberta, it might not be the best idea to have the province of Alberta take the lead on something like this, because they have been known to, and I'm not going to speak for Kevin here or say anything official on behalf of the AESO, but occasionally the Alberta government has been known to commission a study with instructions on what the conclusion of the study should be. And so I don't know that we necessarily need that's why I see a big role for other stakeholders to get together to produce their own reports as well on what they see the potential benefits as being too. And so that could be universities, First Nations, Indigenous communities, other stakeholders as well, generators, transmission operators. I do think having a provincial voice is important, but I think the political aspect to all of this in Alberta needs a reframe for sure. And so I think framing it in Alberta as economic opportunity and increased reliability would be helpful. But then also sort of not trying to come up with the conclusion before you've even finished the report would be a good thing too.
Maybe can I just do one quick insertion there so totally agree. And in fact, one of the main things we did at the council was produce an appendix that only energy nerds would love, but it sets out best practices and key features for pathway assessments, for energy roadmaps, because it's absolutely true. And there's modelers here in the crowd. They're like, you can pick scenarios and assumptions that are going to produce the outcomes you want. A proper assessment is going to not fall into those pitfalls and those temptations.
I'm not even going to try to add on to the specific points these guys made, because it's I just say here. I mean, we especially around aligning mandates. I think that is a big gap and a big opportunity. I mean, there's system operators, regulators, and utilities, question whether or not they're allowed to really have climate as something that they need to balance or allowed to balance in their costs and their proposals in their work. And I think that alignment is really needed. But I guess I would just maybe go in a little bit different direction, just to point out the need to bring along grassroots. I mean, the folks in the communities. I mean, there's a lot. I mean, with the doubling and tripling of the electricity system, there's a lot of backyards going to get touched potentially, and folks need to be engaged. And like, unfortunately, I mean, you see a little bit of a battleground around that, where I mean, there's some research out. I mean, looking at just the way, for example, anti-renewables campaigns have really proliferated in the US and have really, I don't know, kind of poisoned the water a little bit, I would say, around energy policy down there in some cases. And I mean, there's a little bit of evidence here and there that that may be happening to some extent in Canada. And it's really unfortunate. I mean, trying to weaponize, I guess, communities and public opinion in that way. So it'd be good if there was a lot more focus on trying to stay fact-based and sort of genuine in the way that those communities and stakeholders are engaged. I think that there's a lot more. The energy transition has a lot more to offer folks than is going to be taken away. And it'd be good to kind of engage folks sort of where they're at and maybe, bring them along.
Okay, thank you all. I think we'll leave it there. Just want to take a moment to thank all of the panelists here for sharing all of this. So, yeah, I would pass it back to you.